Okay, back again, doing it the new fashioned way, I guess. Sorry again about this. My baby and wife are in the way of me getting things done, in a good way, but I'm really sorry. This is not the norm. I've never not showed up to class this many times in my entire teaching career. I apologize, but my life has drastically changed. Anyway, Nigeria, Odie, shout out. I'm sorry that we're not doing this in class. I'd appreciate your insight as we go along, but I'll do my best. Following the same outline as usual here, no surprises there. Here's Nigeria on a map. This is the most populous country in the whole of Africa, the wealthiest, largest economy, I guess, at least in sub-Saharan Africa, if not the entire continent. Pretty important place for lots of different reasons that we shall discuss. But before we do here, I will provide a little bit of context here. You know how much I concern myself with, being aware of the obvious and realities and not saying stupid, ignorant things. Um, First and foremost, I absolutely despise it when people refer to Africa as though it were one country, because it's not, number one, obviously. And number two, when you look at its size, it's actually huge. I don't know if it's the largest continent. I guess Asia is probably larger by land mass, but in no small part because of or thanks to the Mercator projection, map projection that's been kind of the standard, at least for most of the 20th century and into the 21st. Things closer to the equator look smaller than they are, and things further away look larger than they are. That's why Greenland looks like it's massive on a lot of maps, but Greenland's actually much, much, much smaller than Africa. I don't think I need to describe much here. You get the idea of the point I'm trying to make with this map. That's I found this in The Economist years ago. It comes in quite handy. But anyway, why study this case? For reasons some of I've just said. It's the most populous country in Africa. It's Africa's largest economy. We'll talk about the resource curse, hint, hint, in a bit. Story we've heard before. Political misrule, social unrest, economic inequality, environmental degradation, all these things will come up. So I won't beat the dead horse. I'll try to get through this set of slides faster than I have of late. But I'll show you a couple of links. And actually, the first one here, Africa's largest economy, click on it in the T-Learn, is from a series that PBS did, PBS NewsHour did on Nigeria several years ago. I think we're up to like 7 years ago, but it's still, sadly and correctly, still very relevant. That link here will talk about the massive economic growth, particularly the boom of the wealthy elite, but it will also highlight much inequality that's present in Nigeria today. So, it is, as I say here, a fascinating case of possibilities, right? That the state should arguably be better funded, less corrupt, better run, better serving the needs of all its citizens, including the poorest, than it does. But the democracy that has existed since 1999 has been an improvement on what came between 1960, the year of independence, and 1999. And we'll talk about that period in a sec. But it's still a very flawed democracy that, really, and for lots of reasons that we talked about in the last content chapter, right, where we talked about post-colonialism and how it can wreck an economy or wreck a country. And post-colonialism has really hindered the growth of Nigerian, we'll say, the growth of democracy. So if we want to talk about growth of size, again, most populous country in Africa and home to one of the world's largest cities, right? Lagos. And this map is, I guess, not too outdated. I don't know what year it's from, but it was projecting the year 2020. So my guess is this is a solid 10 years old, if not more. But at the time in 2006, Lagos was the 14th largest city in the world, and it's only gotten bigger, right? Because how underdevelopment, Inequalities can be a real catalyst for population growth. I think I've beaten that dead horse throughout the semester, but you get the idea. I stress this here because we're talking yet again about an important place, right? Large country, large economy, massive inequality, one of the world's largest cities, et cetera, et cetera. But again, since independence, from 1960, particularly to 1999, there was this is another classic case of pendulum swings, kind of like Brazil, flirting with democracy, yet finding itself under dictatorial rule, particularly by military leaders. And anytime you see this, especially in a post-colonial setting, the stage is set for corruption, and then add to that the resource curse, and there you go, right? And we're again to the point of the semester where I don't think I need to beat the dead horse that much. You should see this coming, right? But what this has meant is that since independence, and I forget the exact year oil was discovered in Nigeria, but it was around that time. I mean, it was either right before or right after independence. But the oil industry and oil exports have driven the economy, and I'll show you some data on this down the road. Just driven the economy for decades, while the population doesn't benefit, right? Becomes at least comparatively poor, right? However, things have looked up since 1999. We'll talk superficially about this in a bit, but still very much a fragile democracy, right? And what do we see in fragile democracies? A lack of rule of law, corruption is just a daily reality. A very weak state that lacks capacity, might have a lot of autonomy from the citizens, thanks in no small part to the resource curse. But it's not a strong state that's able to carry out basic tasks. If you've already watched the link on the Nigerian economy, you'll know what I'm talking about. People living in squalor and the state not doing anything about it, right? So rising poverty, very much a reality, because all these things contribute to a rapidly growing population. And you know how that can hinder growth in an underdeveloped state, right? So it makes it's like a downward spiral, right? It just exacerbates all the problems. It makes it harder to turn things around. Add to this ethno-religious conflict, which will very much be a reality throughout the balance of my talk here. I hope you've heard of Boko Haram. I mean, sadly, but I hope you've paid attention to the news enough in recent years or so, the last 15 of them, to have heard of this, I think, Africa's largest terrorist group, perhaps, based in northeastern Nigeria, very much Sunni Muslim group that has destabilized the state. The first time I taught comparative politics actually was in Turkey in 2014. And I had a couple of students from Nigeria, and they're from northern Nigeria, and I didn't know that at the time. But when it was Nigeria Day, they definitely were sitting up front. Still hadn't bothered to read for the class that day, but I asked, hey, why are you guys in Turkey? And both of them said together, Boko Haram. This is very much destabilized the state, so to the point that young people from the region, if wealthy enough, will avoid the problem, right? And that's not the only thing that threatens the state, of course. I mean, all the above as well. But the question that folks in my line of work ask, and Nigeria is a case like India, China, Russia, that someone like me has got to know more about Nigeria than the average bear. But I'll freely admit I'm no expert. But what I do read about Nigeria, and often enough. And I'll share an article with you from the Atlantic that just came out after the elections earlier this year in 2023. But that really poses this question: can Nigeria survive as a unified state, right? Or will all of these problems that the state faces lead to its disintegration, right? And some folks throw around this term. I'm not a fan of it at all. The state nation, because this is very much a multicultural, multinational, multi-religious state that, for some reason, compared to other states with similar makeups, does exhibit a relatively strong level of patriotism comparatively, to claim to be Nigerian from its citizens, but under the surface lacks, hundreds of fissures, many of which we'll talk about here. Gonna fly over a bunch of particularly longer term history, but worth pointing out, as the textbook does, Pre-colonial Nigeria was not some underdeveloped, poorly organized, wasteland of little villages or something, right? There were several early kingdoms. The Hausa, the Yoruba, and the Igbo are your main umbrella ethnic groups that are extensions of earlier kingdoms that have existed for nearly 1,000 years. But again, these are the three major ethnic groups that you see in Nigeria today. I'll come back to them in a sec. Europeans arrive on Nigeria's coast. I don't know if the Portuguese were first to touch what would become Nigeria, but it was the British who got their mitts on what would become Nigeria officially by the Treaty of Berlin of 1885. I've talked about the Conference of Berlin of 1884-85, which culminated in ended the scramble for Africa. It's the European powers decided who would control what, and that's indicative in this map here, which I think I've pulled up in class before, but you can see where the French and the British controlled a majority of the continent, but there are lots of other interests in Africa as well, European interests, right? The Portuguese, the Italians to a lesser extent, the Belgians in the Congo very much wrecked the Congo, Germany as well, often forgotten about, and of course my Portuguese friends were the first actual Europeans to set up shop all around the continent, but mainly just had trading posts. So the Portuguese were relatively late to the colonization game the way the other Europeans played it. Worth mentioning, were we in class here, I would ask you what this country is. This is, of course, modern day Ethiopia, and why it was not colonized. It's because there were enough Christians there that the Europeans decided to lay off. The Italians had their eyes on it, and the Italians did colonize what would become part of Somalia, the whole of Somalia today, and Eritrea, which only became independent somewhat recently from Ethiopia, I want to say within the last 20 years or so. But the nice thing is, if you're ever in a place like, say, Minneapolis, or for a brief time where I studied in Emporia, Kansas, most of my undergrad, there were a bunch of Somalian refugees working at a meat packing plant in Kansas and opened a restaurant. So I was pleasantly surprised by the coffee that I would get after eating my goat at the Somali restaurant in central Kansas. Anyway, that aside, zipping forward to independence, 1960, there was a lot of optimism, we'll say, at what could become of Nigeria immediately after independence. And that's exactly when the film Half of a Yellow Sun starts. The film opens right on Independence Day in 1960. Well, it actually opens with a little bit of news footage from prior. The lady who just died, what's her face, Elizabeth, had come to Nigeria before independence when she was queen, et cetera, et cetera. But you'll see the film starts off with great optimism, we'll say. But this was not meant to be, as unrest and violence begin in the West. Yoruba dominated Nigeria, and then that led to an Igbo coup, which overthrew the government and started, it helps trigger the Nigerian Civil War, or the Biafran War for Independence, depending on who you ask. But it also really triggered this pendulum swing back and forth between flirting with democracy and predominantly military rule. So the film as well ends with, I don't know if it ends actually at the conclusion of the Civil War with Biafra's defeat, but this is the main political thread running through the film. The film as well is one big hot love rhombus, love pentagon. I don't know. There's some romantic tension, if you will, throughout the film. You could watch it and not really know a thing about Nigerian politics and still, get something out of it. But watching the film now after reading the chapter or listening to me ramble on will make the film a lot more a better use of your time. You'll get a lot more out of it. But here you see, when we say Biafra, this is what we're talking about: south eastern Nigeria. And again, this is traditionally the Igbo homeland. It's where you find the greatest concentration of um, the Igbo people. It's also where most of the oil is found, and I'll come back to that later and how that can be problematic. But anyway, as I said, pendulum swings back and forth, 1960 to the late 1990s. By the early 1990s, you get yet another um, uh, you get another coup attempt. You get more canceled elections, but this was the time of the Third Republic. Uh, and by the time Nigeria could pull out of that, um, from an oppressive authoritarian military leader, you got the execution of a playwright, poet, and activist named Ken Saro-Wiwa, who was very vocal in protesting what Royal Dutch Shell Company was doing in the Niger Delta, and to the point that it cost him his life. Um, that was before I was in college, but I was in high school by '95 and paying attention enough to know, wow, something's going on in Nigeria. Learned a lot more about it when I got into college and studied geography. But anyway, um, the Abacha dictatorship, upon his death, transitioned finally into a period of democracy and civil rule that has continued, however delicately, to today. So let's have a look and see what the political regime is like now. Nigeria, since 1960, has gone through 6 different constitutions. So the problem hasn't been coming up with rules. Like, there's an understanding that there needs to be rules of the game, but unfortunately, you have a political class of every possible, religious, I doubt all possible ethnic stripes within the region or within the country. But point is, everybody's been good at ignoring the rules. Anyone who's taken power, no matter where they're from, north, south, Muslim, Christian, etc., has done very good at abiding by the rules. Originally, like a lot of post-colonial histories show us, Nigeria was going to be a parliamentary democracy. However, even before the current um, constitution took force, the current democratic period in 1999, 20 years prior, the decision was made to switch to an American model, a presidential model, because that's a better way to account for it. And you know this by now, say it with me, to account for um, diversity within the state, right? You allow greater autonomy to federal units, states in this case, that allows the people who live there, who don't share the same ethnic, religious, linguistic identity as the folks, the states around them. You give them greater autonomy to handle decisions, handle some decision making on their own. I will come back to this, though. Nigeria is a federal state, but it's one in which the central government has a lot more control over what states do than in the United States, for at the very least. There is a directly elected president and a bicameral legislature, which should not surprise us. I mean, when you say large country, federalism, presidential system, this shouldn't surprise you. You see here that people do vote directly for the president, directly for state and local government, and directly for both chambers of Congress. So, this, I'm sure we could add more detail to this. I can quibble about any of these silly figures that I choose to show here. This is an example here of the pendulum swings, or well, this not an example. This literally shows it to you. You can see who's been in power since from 1960 to now. The previous president. There's a president elect to add to this list here. Yeah, you can see the path to power here: elected indirectly, coup, 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 elected, coup, coup, appointed, coup, on down the line here. And you can see a tradition of rotating, well, not exactly rotating, but back and forth between Muslim and Christian rule. I will say this: no, at least since the time of democracy in 1999, here, no Igbo has held the presidency in Nigeria. And I think that is a longer term holdover from the Biafran War for Independence, or the Nigerian Civil War. The rest of the country, I think, looks at the Igbo with great skepticism. That's also evidenced in the film, by the way. The main characters are all Igbo. You will see this play out in the film should you choose to watch Half of a Yellow Sun. But anyway, President does a lot of things that presidents do in the United States. However, given Nigeria's unique, well, it's not unique federalism necessarily, but its unique composition and how federalism is meant to accommodate that to ease ethnic tension, there's a what they call federal character principle, in which a president is pretty much required to support to appoint, high level ministers and civil servants from each Nigerian state, right? And that's the best way, really, in Nigeria, because maybe with the exception of Lagos, to a lesser extent Abuja, the folks who are there within any given state, if you take one person from each state, you're going to the idea is to assuage ethnic tension, right? Because you're going to have different, folks from different ethnic groups among all different states, and this is meant to ease ethnic rivalry, but it also bloats the bureaucracy and opens the door for corruption, right? I mean, again, we saw this before. We saw this with the last case study we looked at on Monday when I showed up to class, and I can't even remember what that was. That's how my brain is working at present. But corruption being the theme here. Corruption is not helped by the fact that the legislature is comparatively very weak. Looks similar. I mean, aside from the fact that folks in the House serve 4-year terms, not 2, and folks in the Senate also serve 4-year terms and not 6. It's kind of similar to what the United States has, right? However, the Senate is a bit different. You've got three seats from each state, and 1 for the capital, Abuja, which is like a federal district like Washington, which doesn't, of course, have representation in the U.S. Congress. The judiciary is, well, at the time of independence, was hoped that it would be something that kept the country, the rule of law going. The system, the state, the independent state, stayed with the British common law jurisprudential legal system, while also allowing states in the north, should they choose, to rule themselves by Sharia law, particularly in the case of family law and banking law. Obviously predominant in the north, because that's where the most of the Muslims in Nigeria reside. But the problem is, when you've got a country that really goes back and forth from pseudo democracy to dictatorship. Unfortunately, the rule of law and the judiciary are the first to suffer, both overt influence to downright oppression from the legislative branch, and that hinders legitimacy in the longer run in the eyes of the people, right? Like I said, add dictatorships to this, and there you go. The electoral system sounds quite nice and democratic here. Directly elected 4-year terms. Everybody, including the president, serves 4-year terms. Presidents are limited to 2 terms. Surprise, surprise. To win a presidential election, you must win a plurality of nationwide votes. It doesn't mean a majority, right? It just means you need more votes than any other candidate. And given how large the country is, how federated it is, how ethnic and religious identity drives so much of the public and voters' decision making, it never boils down to merely 2 candidates. So I don't know if since '99, if any candidate has ever won an outright majority of votes. But what you need to account for this plurality instead of a majority, you also need to win at least 25% of the ballots cast in at least 2/3 of the states, because that would indicate voters making a conscious choice not based solely on ethnic or religious identity, right? So the idea for this mechanism is to ensure that whoever wins, 30-some% of the vote, which is usually what happens, still can claim enough support outside of their state, region, religion of support, right? If no candidate wins outright in the first round, a runoff's held between the top 2 candidates. Elections held earlier this year, 2023, one candidate won, I think 36% of the vote and collected 25% of the ballots cast in 2/3 of the state. So there's no need for a runoff. So anyway, add to this And I'm not good at explaining this very well. This is where I would have asked for help from Odie, were we in class. But at least one party, major party, the PDP, which had been in power for quite some time, was able to do so by nominating every 2 terms candidates from the North or the South, which is to say Christian or Muslim. Right, so the PDP was really aiming to be a unifying national party. I don't use the term national loosely, but you know what I mean, like statewide party, right? However, doing so could limit the pool of qualified candidates while also exacerbating ethnic divisions, which it was meant to avoid, right? Let's say one cycle after having nominated somebody from the North, the best looking candidate is somebody again from the North, but the party rules would prevent that person, like the most qualified candidate, from running, opting for someone from the South, right? And one of the greatest presidential names in history, Goodluck Jonathan, president for part of 2 terms in Nigeria. I think he assumed office in 2010 because the president at the time had passed away. And when he chose to run for re-election, since he was a Southerner, a Christian, and the president, Yaradua had been Muslim. There was some, I forget the nuances of it, but the tensions even within the party caused the All Progressives Party, or the APC, to spin off from the PDP, the People's Democratic Party, also employing, I don't know if it employs a similar zoning type system, but it has been the party that's been in power the most since its founding, while also, again, attempting to reconcile the micro and the macro, right? The local, individual qualities, religion, language, region of candidate A, B, and C, while still aiming for a wider electoral, casting wider electoral net, right? Trying to still gain votes from other regions of the country. But anyway, other information to say. Again, I ramble because I know a lot of this stuff, but I don't know it that well. I only talk about Nigeria about once a year, twice a year in this class. So here we go. House of Representatives, similar to the United States, right? Single member districts apportioned by population. I don't know if gerrymandering is much of a thing, how that works. That might be something I need to do as a take home. The Senate, I mentioned, the Senate represents states, obviously. I mean, following the U.S. model, 3 from each state, 1 from the capital. The winner-take-all plurality systems generally favor the PDP, but again, Buhari won. He was the previous president, 2-term president, brought an APC majority into the legislature. But although these are the 2 major statewide, countrywide parties, several smaller parties benefit from ethnic groups in voting blocks. I'm sure that's how Igbo interests are best represented in Congress. Local government, as I mentioned once already, comparatively to the United States, state and local governments have less autonomy from the federal government and few ways to generate revenue. That is also the case in Mexico. Again, very undeniably a federal system, but where the federal government really can keep the states to heal as it wishes. And in the case of Nigeria, given the importance of oil revenue, that's very true, right? The states need to cultivate good relations with the central government to make sure they can pay to keep the lights on, right? And distributing oil revenues is, of course, a contentious topic. There are formulas for doing this between the national and local governments based on population and such. But again, it's contentious because most of the oil is produced in the South and more explicitly in the Southeast, right? The Igbo homeland, where folks down there want greater fiscal restructuring to keep more of what they environmentally have to literally pay for, while the northern states, which is code for Muslim states, favor continued centralization, and the tension rolls on again because of the marginalization of the Igbo since the Civil War, and the fact that by a very slim margin, Muslims outnumber non-Muslims in Nigeria. And I'll show you some data on this in a sec. What else to say? Other important players in the regime here, the military. Um, most Nigeria's most powerful leaders and even its elected presidents have had military backgrounds. The previous president Buhari did. I don't know off the top of my head who else, but it's pretty much all of them, because the military was a way to, provide social mobility. Um, and the positive, I guess, to say here, despite Nigeria's history of coups, the military has not yet intervened in the Fourth Republic. So since 1999, there's been no direct involvement of the military in politics. However, the military is still very much involved in things political, or things that require the attention of government, and that is to protect the state and its citizens from the threat of Boko Haram. Got a link to that you can watch there if you're interested. This one's not too long, and neither is the other. But while busy fighting oil thieves, because like in a lot of developing places, I know this is a real problem in Mexico as well. There are entrepreneurial criminals, we'll say, who are getting very good at stealing petroleum and selling it on the black market. So, the perhaps the military has been too busy to think about overthrowing a president, because it has many other things to do. But there it is. If you're interested in these topics, please click there. As we move on here, political conflict and competition. I've mentioned a couple of parties. We're not going to talk at any great length about parties, because this is very much uh, a political system that's driven by ethnic divisions, and less so a left and a right ideological continuum, right? Regional party identity has exacerbated ethnic tensions and complicated efforts to legitimize national party politics. And again, it's only really been the two major parties, I mentioned the PDP and the AFC or the APC, that have been able to gain traction around the entire country. Given the realities of what's happened since independence and since the Fourth Republic took root, the democracy. Again, I've given you lots of examples how the federal system and custom within the executive branch has meant to alleviate some of these tensions. They're not going away. They're not going away. You'll see these tensions play out well in the film too, undoubtedly. So give it a watch, or read the novel Half of a Yellow Sun. It's also quite good. I've actually used that when I teach international law. Long story abbreviated, I won't go into now. But anyway, you'll see it. You'll see what we're talking about. What I'm talking about right now in the film. Questions on the quality of Nigerian democracy abound. Again, because people are so frustrated, I'll return to the term legitimacy, which has come up more than several times now. When the people are well aware of governmental corruption, political criminal violence, and their poverty is not alleviated, they grow frustrated, right? And this also tends to make people want to blame the immediate other, right? In a country where everyone is an other for somebody else in some way, shape, or form, right? So we see election results becoming more regionally divided. More and more Nigerians are overtly dissatisfied with how democracy works, and voter turnout is on the decline. So this is straight out of the O'Neill textbook here, but of the countries that we survey in the text here, Nigerians are the most dissatisfied with how their country is or how their democracy is working. I think the UK is so high here because this data was collected or published at least in early 2020, and I'm sure there's a lot of Brexit frustration right there in the case of the UK. But nonetheless, you can see here Nigerians do take the cake here. And oil, of course, doesn't help any of what we've described here, right? Or what you've read about. It makes it a lot easier for leaders at the federal level to co-opt regional and local leaders, state leaders, by literally paying them off, giving them political appointments, etc. Right. So I don't think I need to harp on this. Right. Oil revenues fuel corruption in this democratic system. Right. The surpluses just become slush funds that those in power can use to co-opt others and try to stay in power. Right. The idea is in the last decade or so that at least election transparency has improved. There was an elaborate system of fingerprinting. The textbook mentioned this to protect the vote here. But there's still ways that money slushes around and can very directly affect democratic politics, right? And we've covered these bases. Worth mentioning again, unrest and mobilization among the Igbo. Long been an activist part of the country in the southeast. We've covered this, civil war, etc. But and I mentioned this once already. No Igbo's ever been elected president. Within the Igbo, you find two political groups that have formed. Both of or at least one of these, the indigenous people of Biafra, has been declared a terrorist group at one point by the government. And you understand how this goes. Whether it's a government crackdown can fuel radicalization. It's the electoral marginalization that the Igbo feel. And again, this is that they're also from the part of the country where most of the oil is produced, and thus most of the environmental damage is faced head on. Right. Add to this, you can talk about other minorities within the state. The Shia Muslim, right? Over most of the Muslims in Nigeria are Sunni, and Shia Muslims also find themselves discriminated against and oppressed by Sunni Muslims within the state. The government has also designated the Islamic movement in Nigeria a terrorist organization. So a lot of folks from the outside really worry that not just that Shia Muslims will be radicalized in a new Shia Muslim group, terrorist group who will form to rival Boko Haram. I'm not necessarily counting on that, but just all the things we've talked about. Just add this to the long list of things that can destabilize the country here. This was mentioned in the film. In the textbook. I think these are obviously Christian folks taking care of their brethren who've passed. I believe the example given in the text were murdered by Muslims in central Nigeria. I don't know the circumstance. I'm not pointing fingers, but here we are, right? Point is, elements of civil society like we see are drawn into insurgencies, right? And violence has become, sadly, very much a daily reality in particularly central Nigeria, right? Boko Haram has carried out lots of killings and kidnappings. That'll be mentioned in the last link that I'll show you down the road in a bit. But I'll show you a map here in a sec, but to give you a real idea of how Christians and Muslims, particularly in the middle of the country, are right geopolitically set to be at each other's throats, right? So sectarian conflict is mitigated by divisions in religious traditions. Again, you've got a lot of ethnic groups that share a religious identity, and that can also be yet another reason for conflict with another neighboring group. So it goes without saying, ethnicity is a very powerful force in this country. And I think I've covered the basis here, how diversity challenges democracy, particularly when folks start to see every political movement as zero sum, right? Where what I lose or what you gain is my loss. And if we're talking about competition among three major ethnic groups, the Hausa Fulani, the Yoruba, and the Igbo. But there's a lot of diversity within all three of these groups. I mean, I think I used the term earlier. These are umbrella terms for ethnic groups. 25% of the population doesn't identify with any of these. And there are several other groups that, stick around 2%. That do not identify with any of the three major groups. I believe Nigeria has like 525 languages spoken within its borders, right? English is the official language, and then Hausa, Yoruba, and Igbo are three other. I think they're called national languages. But again, very diverse state, right? And this, I've talked about this. Ethnic violence has continued. Economic motivations are obviously present as well. Here is my favorite map here that I use in class. I'm not going to harp on it, but again, you can just see, and this is obviously not as detailed as it could be given the scale, but Nigeria is a very diverse state, right? With borders drawn by the Brits a long time ago, right? Add to the ethnic diversity here, we have religious divisions, or most of you would say divides, which is incorrect. But a lot of civil conflict has a religious component, right? Like I said, Muslims overwhelming in the north, Christians overwhelming in the south. Sharia law has served to both help and hurt, right? Muslims can maybe view their state governments and local governments in the north with greater legitimacy if they believe that the application of Sharia law is a way to overcome corruption, but it's not a very forgiving criminal law, we'll put it that way. And then add to this, it really, there's 5 different schools of within Sharia, juridical thinking, legal schools, if you will. And to add to this the fact, so which do we apply, and then how are we going to treat the Shia even, or non-Muslims in the state, right? So there we are. Religion and politics. I'm not a fan, but there we are. Nigeria employs it delicately and somewhat successfully, but who knows? This is a nice map I use. Gives you an idea here what's going on. The 10th parallel, global parallel, runs right here where my cursor is, and this black line is, however imperfect, a representation of the division between overwhelmingly Muslim populations to the line of the north and overwhelmingly Christian populations to the south, right? Christian and animist. And Nigeria, again, here is a country that is, you'll hear people refer to it as 50-50, Muslim, non-Muslim. It's just a bit more Muslim than non-Muslim, right? And in a democracy, if everyone votes according to their religious identity, or you can see how this can turn out, right? Especially if you have, say, an elected Muslim leader deciding what to do with the oil that's found down here, right? Which is where the Igbo are up into, Yoruba, ethnic Yoruba, are on top of some land where oil might be extracted. But again, if you've got it would be easy for someone from the South, whatever their religious and ethnic identity, to be upset if, say, they feel even a democratically elected Muslim president is taking their resources, right? You can see what's going on. You can understand how tension can arise. To alleviate this tension, and I think this is creative. This is not the only case of a country doing this, but Abuja, the capital of Nigeria, is right in the middle of the country, right? The capital previously had been Lagos. Another very important city is Port Harcourt that will get a lot of mention in the film. But nonetheless, the idea was by the early 90s to relocate the capital to the middle of the country. We call this a forward capital. So it's intentionally placed there to appease and alleviate ethnic tension between those who live to the north and those who live to the south. And for a time, this was the fastest growing city in the world. And again, not unique. Brasilia is the capital of Brazil, as we know, but only since 1960. Prior to that, it was Rio. And the idea of moving, Brasilia is not right in the middle of the country, but close to it. Madrid has not always been the capital of Spain. It was decided in the 1500s to move the capital there. Even Washington, D.C. has not always been the capital of the United States, right? It was New York, Philadelphia for a short time, and the capital moved south, right? Because that's where the people moved. So there's usually a reason to do this. It's often a creative way to try to alleviate tension within a state, or better attend to those in different parts geographically, parts of the country, it was a short-term fix, I think. Short-term fix for Nigeria. Moving on here to talk about ideology and political culture. Um, Ideology takes a backseat to communal concerns, right? The ethnic and religious uh, sense, right? Thus, Nigerians do have strong local identity and a negative reaction to military rule, which often helped grow local identity. So I guess I've contradicted myself too, though, because I mentioned earlier in the slides here this, there is definitely the citizens are aware of their civic identity as Nigerians, but that doesn't make them patriotic necessarily, right? We'll put it that way. A strong sense of civic identity, but that doesn't necessarily mean. So I guess I'm not contradicting myself as much. A strong sense of patriotism necessarily, right? Until then, the soccer team's playing in a major tournament. But many Nigerians, and this is a positive, continue to support democracy and reject military rule, right? Again, the presidential system only allows for any one person to serve 2 terms. This is a people very much skeptical of a system that would be dominated by a single party or leader, right? Anyway. But support for democracy and trustworthy leaders rather than economic performance. Unfortunately, most leaders in Nigeria, like in a lot of countries with similar histories and similar realities, end up leaving office not very popular, right? If you watch the first link I posted, you'll know that economic performance has gone well for some, but not for all. As we continue talking about the political economy here, won't dwell on this, but again, Africa's largest economy, driven by oil. Oil revenues make up for 90% of foreign currency earnings and half of what the government takes in, right? Nigeria is a textbook example of a country suffering from the resource curse, right? That resources are a barrier to modernization and democracy. I don't need to beat the horse anymore. You know this by now. This is obviously dated information before even Larson was born, but you can see how quickly the makeup of the economy turned around from independence to the height of the dictatorship years, right? 1960 to 75, oil just boomed and dominated the economy, and that has not changed, right? So, this has not been good for democracy, right? And again, 1960, year of independence, and oil took over the economy immediately after that. So, not excusing bad decisions made by dictators or anything, but we can understand here how it's been difficult to run this country well, given its post-colonial history and its economic realities, right? So, the government doesn't have to tax people, doesn't have to listen to them, right? Those once in power can buy off stakeholders or finance repression, right? It is worth mentioning, I took this out of the slides to save some time, but I think Nigerian Congress people are the highest paid in the world. I want to say if you're elected to Congress in Nigeria, either house, your salary is like around $1 million a year, which is way more than even folks in the U.S. Senate make annually. So like 5 times as much. So anyway, having oil allows you to do that, right? And that really just invites corruption among your elites, right? Because the state is a mechanism to just siphon off oil wealth, right? And it doesn't help your government to run smoothly. It doesn't help your government to be any more fiscal responsible to others. And it wrecks budgets, right? So there we are. Add to this massive inequality, right? The 80% system, 80% lives on under $200 a day, or $2 a day. That's the international poverty line. While 80% of Nigeria's wealth is held by 1% of the population, right? So, and nearly all of the wealthy elite are connected to government. There's my line. Nigerian politicians are among the highest paid in the world. And oil just wrecks the economy. I don't remember off the top of my head. Maybe it's mentioned in that PBS clip, the first one, if you watched it, what percent of the economy is made up of the informal sector. But I guarantee you it's a ton. Agriculture by occupation, 70% of the population, right? This is still undoubtedly a poor country, okay? And oil might mask that a bit by even though it's a huge population, it's going to the oil is going to drive up the GDP per capita, but that doesn't tell us a thing about inequality, right? You know this by now. I'll stop talking about this issue. Speaking of issues, this is my last hyperlink. It's a very good kind of discussion among three people: a journalist for PBS, another journalist for PBS, and then author Chimamanda Adichie, who wrote the novel Half of a Yellow Sun. So I encourage you, if you want to watch the film, watch this interview with her. And she is one of my favorite, I think, contemporary authors. I've read several of her novels. Americana is an excellent book if you're at all interested in migration or Nigerian politics. Or even what it is to be Black in the United States. Like it's a great book. You'd learn a lot no matter who you are. I'm sure you'd learn a lot from reading it. I know I did. But anyway, she's got a lot to say about current issues in Nigeria, including Boko Haram. I'm not going to dwell on this anymore. I've mentioned Boko Haram enough, I think, but this and concerns over Igbo independence movements are seen by many outsiders as maybe two of the largest gravest problems, if you will, that Nigeria faces. And again, this is my last slide. I'll leave it at this, but oil, enough said. That a lot of ethnic conflict is either has to do with where the oil comes out of the ground or how the money is distributed. Theft is very much theft of oil is very much a real thing, which just leads to criminal violence and destabilizes local communities, and then not to mention the environmental problems and then the threats to democracy, right? All there. This is a textbook example. I'll say it again. There we are. Apologies yet again for having it to do this way. I appreciate your patience. Thanks again. We'll see you soon.